Hi, I'm Florencia, and I will be moderating this conversation alongside Vicente. I'm currently in 6P and at the brink of graduating, yay for me. I'm a former IB philosophy student who's actually super keen on talking about the purpose of life, altruism, human nature, etc. And I'm really thrilled to listen to you guys, Xandra and Matt, dwell the specifics of the relationship between science and religion.
Thank you, Florencia. I'm Vicente, the second moderator for this event. I'm in S5, so I'm still a long while away from graduation, and I'm currently studying philosophy at higher level for the IB. My IA for philosophy is actually on philosophy of religion, and I also take physics higher. So the relationship between science and religion is of a particular interest to me. And now I would ask both participants, Matt and Xandra, to present themselves, state where they work, where they have studied, and what is their initial view on this issue.
Yeah, so I studied undergraduate in the United States, and I studied biology. And then I did some further studies at Oxford University in philosophy and theology. And I focused in apologetics, which is to make a defense for something as true. And then after that, I continued on and did a master's degree in New Zealand on conservation biology. And I'm not currently researching. Some people refer to me as a scientist, but I'm not actually conducting science right now. I am, doing a lot of writing and stuff like that, but not working in the lab at the moment, hopefully again someday. So that's where I'm at right now.
Hi everybody. I studied my undergraduate in the UK. My undergraduate was in astrophysics and then postgraduate in science education, also in the UK. So I'm currently actually working in Peru, teaching here in Lima, teaching IB, among other things, primarily in physics. And I've been in education for nearly 10 years now, teaching different aspects of science, specializing in physics.
Great. So with that being said, some initial questions to start. Xandra or Matt, could you please share with us your stance on this debate on science and religion? You're an atheist, religious, spiritual, etc. And with that in mind, why do you believe that science does or doesn't prove that God exists? Just to start, if Xandra would like to go first, or Matt.
Sure. Yeah. I should also mention I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I didn't say that at the beginning, but I love what you're doing here. I love the idea of seeing something from multiple different viewpoints. I think that's something we need to do more. So I love what the students are doing, and just want to encourage you to continue that. And I appreciate the question about why do you think that science proves or doesn't prove that God exists? I think it's an interesting question, but my answer is that I don't think science proves God exists, but I also don't think that science disproves the existence of God. And the reason is I don't think science can prove or disprove the existence of something that's metaphysical. And God is spirit, and science is about observing the physical world. So we can't measure love in a test tube, but we can't measure justice on the Richter scale or something like that. And so science can't prove the existence of goodness or beauty or truth or any of these metaphysical things, pardon me. But other things do convince us that these are parts of our everyday reality, right? So that being said, for me, as a background as a biologist, I don't think that nature is neutral in the way that a lot of people say that it is. I think it does point to something else, because the more that I've studied nature, the more I've seen that it points me to something that's beyond just the physical, something that transcends what I can see or taste or smell. And there are lots of, minute details that I could go into. I want to keep my preliminary answer here to like 5 minutes or less, but I can touch more on, the fine-tuning argument, which I know Logan Gates mentioned the last time you guys all met together. And Logan Gates and I went to Oxford together, I should mention. So we're good friends. He's a brilliant man, way smarter than I am. So I'm glad that you all got to hear from him last time. But all that to say, with regards to if there is any kind of evidence for God, I think that just following the logic, if there was a God who did exist and he wanted humanity to be aware of his existence, for me, it follows logically he would want to leave a marker or an indicator of some sort to show others that he was there. And that's why I believe he sent his son, Jesus Christ, into the world to show others that there is a God who loves you. And Jesus himself says, if you want to know what God looks like, if you want to be convinced that there is a God out there, look to me. If you want to see God, look here, is basically what he says. And so he says that in John chapter 14. And as I go, I will reference through the Bible, whatever I'm saying, because I want people to be able to look it up and not think that I'm just like making things up to support my position. But so in John 14, he says, if you want to see the Father, look at me, believe in me, that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or else believe on account of the works. And when he says that, he's talking about the miracles that he did in the past, and also in reference to the resurrection, which he was about to be killed when he said that. So the resurrection for me was a deeply impactful, observable event that we're still talking about 2,000 years later, right? And if I had to point to an historical and observable event that was a strong indicator of the existence of God, I would point to the historical person of Jesus Christ. And again, this doesn't 100% prove the existence of God, but it is incredibly significant and worth investigating. And it's part of why I, as a scientist, have a very firm belief that God does exist and that he wants people to find him. So, but I'll leave it there, and Matt, would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, thanks. That's a lot of very interesting points I'm sure we'll be diving into later on. I think it was interesting about whether science can prove or disprove the existence of God. I think something that we have to be careful with in science is that word prove, because science isn't necessarily something that deals in absolutes. We deal in confidence, in probabilities, and in evidence. You will never find a scientist saying they're 100% certain of something, because all it takes is one exception to then say, well, clearly, that 100% isn't true. So I think the idea of proving or disproving something is a very difficult one, and one that we should tread very lightly on. And I think that's something that can be sensationalized by media at times, reporting on science, that scientists have proved or scientists have disproved. All we can do is say with a great certainty that the chances are very high that we have made a discovery, or we have found a new concept, a new phenomena. So from my point of view, I don't hold any religious or spiritualist beliefs. I choose to base mine in the tangible, and choose to believe really in terms of anything approaching a spirituality. I know I mentioned that I see myself more as a humanist. I choose to put my beliefs in people and the way that they think, and their actions following kind of logical paths and consequences. So as to whether there isn't a God, I think for me, based on my opinions, I think there is very little tangible evidence, I would say, in terms of for a God, in terms of things that can be peer-reviewed, in terms of be backed up by not necessarily irrefutable evidence, but evidence that is difficult to argue with. That's not about opinion or passing on of messages, but evidence that is clear and natural to the world. And then on the other hand, I think you say there is evidence that it's difficult to say there is no God, because it's such a difficult concept to nail down, I think, in order to disprove. In terms of producing good science, what we would very often set out to do is build a hypothesis and then to attempt to disprove that hypothesis. And if the hypothesis holds true under stress, it implies that it's a good hypothesis. Not that it tells the truth, but that maybe we haven't found a way to unpick it yet. But these hypotheses have to be very clear, very testable under very certain conditions. So I think the concept of a God, not necessarily just the Christian God, but a God across religions, across different cultures, is something that is very difficult to pin down, because it's not something that we discuss as being physical and being tangible within the world that we live in. It's difficult to say exactly the properties that it has in order to attempt to disprove those properties or gain evidence of those properties. So I think the idea of whether there is or isn't a God, is that provable, is a very difficult discussion to have. One that's very interesting to open up, but one that's very, very difficult, really. So I think that's something that I'm sure we'll get into during this conversation about the difference between sort of proof, and again, using that word carefully, and belief and faith, and those kind of three things there being different ways of approaching something, because essentially within the field of science, we have to have a little faith. We have faith in the peer review system. We have faith in the evidence of our own eyes. You know, how much can we trust our observations? How confident we can be in our own measurements? So I think that's something that we can get into and discuss quite a bit. So yeah, trying to kind of round that off. Does science prove or disprove there isn't a God? I think it's a difficult question to answer, because we need to identify exactly what we mean by a God. And we also need to realize the fact that proving or disproving something entirely is essentially impossible. We can only talk in terms of our confidence and probabilities.
So that's very interesting from both of you. Thank you very much. From what I gather, it seems that science isn't the most appropriate tool to use to talk about God, either because he is a metaphysical being and not a physical one, or because proof in science in general, whether it's about God or anything else, is never as absolute as we would normally believe. However, it does seem that science can indicate one towards the right direction, either way. So is there there's a popular perception, let's say, that science is inherently in conflict with faith, because the former is about the stuff that you can see and the latter is precisely about believing what you can't see. So do you think that there is that inherent conflict, or are there some areas of overlap between faith and science? Now, either one of you can go first.
I can go first again, unless Matt, I don't want to go first each time, sorry. I do have a thought. I think this is a great question. So if science is about believing what you observe, and faith is about believing, as you said, in what you can't see, how can these two things go together? I think it's a really good question, and it's a question that a friend of mine asked me recently, who's an atheist, and he brought this up in the context of something that he read in the book of Proverbs. In Proverbs 3, actually, I can just look it up here. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. And so he said, this doesn't make sense to me, because I don't want to follow a God who is anti-understanding. If God just wants us to shut our eyes and believe without thinking, that's not the kind of God that I want to follow. And I said, great. I don't want to follow that kind of God either. I don't want to follow a God who says you shouldn't use your mind or you shouldn't seek knowledge. But I wish that my friend had read just a bit further down that chapter, which I actually encouraged him to do, because if you read just a little further, it says, blessed is the one who finds wisdom and the one who gets understanding. The gain from her is better than the gain from silver, and her profit is better than gold. And then it says, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth, by understanding he established the heavens, and by his knowledge the deeps broke open. And then it says, my son, do not lose sight of these. So wisdom, understanding, knowledge, these are things that we're meant to find and not lose sight of and take hold of. So I don't think that God is anti-understanding or anti-knowledge at all. I don't think he wants us to give up our sense of reason. The Bible even says, worship God with your mind. But someone might come back with Hebrews 11, which says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen, right? The conviction of things not seen. But again, if you read a little further, it says, by faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen is not made out of things that are visible. So in both cases, we see that faith itself, according to the Bible, is not about believing in something even when we don't have reasons to believe in it. That's a dangerous kind of faith. That's what we call blind faith. And you don't want that kind of faith that just believes for the sake of believing. You want to have reasons for why you believe in something. But true faith, according to the Bible, allows you to go beyond your understanding. So we can only see so far, we can only comprehend so far. And faith expands the horizon of our knowledge. It doesn't minimize it. And that's, in my mind, why faith and science go so well together. They're both concerned with discovering reality. So I can see a glimpse in the laboratory, but faith helps me get a little bit of a bigger glimpse of the picture. And one way that I think of this is, so one time I was stuck in traffic. I was on my way to work, and I was really worried that I was going to be late, and it was bumper to bumper and just brake lights all the way down, right? But as I crested the top of the hill, I was able to see down below that the traffic on the highway was breaking up and the cars were going really fast again. So immediately I wasn't worried about being late to work anymore because I knew I was going to make it on time. But my car still was just inching along very slowly, but my perspective had changed. And that for me, I think, is what faith is. It's the assurance of things that haven't come yet, but that you know are coming, that you know you will partake of. So that's kind of a biblical idea of faith, and in my mind, why faith and science marry together so well. They're both concerned with understanding reality.
I quite like the idea of seeing more and broadening your horizons being quite important. It's quite interesting. I just had to note down there the exact word that you used. That was what I was about, the idea of conviction. I think that this is possibly a place where science and faith may conflict a little, which is, in science, having conviction can be problematic in terms of, if you are researching something and you already think you know what you're going to find, it can sometimes not necessarily blind you to the truth, but blinker you into maybe following a research technique because you think it will give you the results that you expect. Or, discarding anomalous results as being anomalous rather than necessarily being something more interesting to investigate. So I think when you're talking about science and faith, I think that cautious faith and science can live together. But one very, very important, almost a founding pillar of science, is the ability to change your mind, the ability to take in new information and say, okay, what I thought before was either wrong or was incomplete. And to change your approach to incorporate the new facts that you have in reevaluating your model. So I think in a religion which insists on kind of discipline and belief and faith, unwavering, unchanging in a particular higher truth that is absolute fact, that I would say would be in conflict with science, with the idea of, that if you have a religion which says, in the face of all doubt, for example, you must still believe. In the face of all obstacles and all challenges, you must believe in this truth. That is essentially the opposite of what we say in science. In science, we say, in the new truths, you have to adapt. You have to take on the new evidence, you have the new ideas, and you have to repurpose them into whatever model, whatever theory that you're working with. At the same time, we have to have faith in evidence, that if something has been demonstrated over and over again with good evidence, with solid practices, with methods that are difficult to unpick, we have to have faith that those findings are good. We have to trust in the other people that have done the research. We have to trust in the people who have reviewed the research and the people who have republished, that they are acting in for want of a better term, good faith, that they are doing that in the way that it is intended. There's no ulterior motive or no subversion of the message there. So I think that clarity of the message, the ability to adapt what you know, to take on board the information, is something that's very important in science. So I think what you said about blind faith, yeah, that does not agree with science. The idea that you believe in something no matter what. You know, I could say I don't believe that gravity exists, and people can drop an apple and say, okay, well, why did that apple fall? I can say, okay, well, maybe that apple falls because, you know, we're in an elevator. The elevator is moving up and the air is stationary. It just looks like the apple is falling. I say, okay, and we go to another place, they drop a pencil. Why did that pencil fall? And I make another excuse. And you know, you can keep doing that, but essentially you have to come to the fact that all of these things are pointing me to a different, pointing me to the concept that there is a force attracting these objects in this direction. And you know, if you go into it with the mindset that I'm going to believe in this truth that I've decided to believe in, and nothing will take me away from that idea, essentially you're not going to be able to do good science. But if you have, okay, I have this belief, and the evidence I get may change that belief, then I can still hold that belief, but maybe I adapt the belief that I have. Maybe I adapt the way I see it, the way I see that the world functions. That I don't think is against science. So you can only look at, you know, the evolution of scientific knowledge throughout human history. We've gone from essentially having no science and being incredibly spiritual and believing most things are caused by the gods, the spirits, the Mother Earth, the different religions and cultures, to slowly stripping some of those things away, by being able to prove, or not prove, but say with great confidence, these things occur for these different reasons, while still, you know, still maintaining these religions and these cultures, that maybe some aspects of the religion become more cultural and become more symbolic rather than a true belief in the, you know, that's the way things are. But we update, and you know, maybe then people assign new ideas to science. You know, the famous, I believe it was Albert Einstein, said God does not play dice. And when in kind of refuting quantum mechanics, while some people may say, well, quantum mechanics is evidence that there is some higher being, that, you know, there is a limit to how much we can see in the world. There becomes a physical point when we actually, we have to say, I can't know anymore. I can't know any more precisely what is happening here. So that's kind of, you know, adapting. You know, if we look back 2,000 years, there was going to be no culture saying, well, quantum mechanics is clearly evidence for a God, because we didn't have that knowledge at that point. So I think the ability to adapt your belief, your faith, is very important for science. That blind faith, or the strict religion that says you must believe in the face of all doubt, that I would say is incompatible with science.
Thank you. Before we carry on with the questions that we had pre-planned for this event, there is a question that we have received in the chat that I think is very important before continuing with the discussion. And it's about defining faith and distinguishing it from belief. What is the difference between the two, and in what context are we using faith? So I was wondering if you can offer just a very brief 30 seconds definition of what you mean by faith. And Matt, let's start with you.
Yeah, so for me, I would say that faith is trusting in something that you can't necessarily ascribe a reason to. So having faith in something coming true or something existing. Whilst a belief, that would be something I say is slightly based more in some evidence, in believing in results, believing in a theory, believing in a person, for example. Whilst faith would be, I would say, something more ethereal, something that's more something you hold deep in your heart, for want of a better word.
Yeah, I don't deviate from that too much, actually, Matt. So with the faith, I would mostly take your definition, except not the without reason part. I think it's the assurance of having belief in someone would be faith, or belief in something. And so you can think of this in terms of you might have faith in your spouse. Do you have all the evidence that your spouse has been faithful to you? Do you have, you know, all the experimentation to show you exactly what kind of personality type they are? Well, no, you've just got to know them. So for me, I think faith doesn't have to have 100% proof, right? Like Matt was saying earlier, science doesn't 100% prove anything. But at the same time, I don't think it's unreasonable. I think faith can be rational. In terms of beliefs aren't necessarily religious at all. You can have philosophical beliefs, scientific beliefs. Beliefs are thoughts that you hold to be true for whatever reason. So there's a slight difference between those two, but it's a great question, and thank you to whoever asked it.
Thanks for the definitions. I think that it will be very useful for this conversation, especially since you will be using faith and believing, and as Matt said, proving, etc. So thanks. Now diving in, since both of you are basically scientists, do you think that metaphysics has a place in, like, does it have a place in scientific thinking, in the generation of knowledge within science? We can start with either of you, Matt or Xandra, perhaps.
I can go again if you. Oh no, go ahead, Matt. Please.
I was just only saying that I don't mind. Yeah, I suppose I can jump in. I think there's a lot of branches of proto-sciences, of pseudosciences, that we have to discard at our peril. A lot of things that the term that I particularly like is proto-science in a lot of senses, which is something that has not quite become a science, but is on its way to becoming a science. I think something that really kind of hangs on the border of that a little would be, in a way, meteorology. We try to predict the weather as best we can, but we still don't really understand how weather works. Essentially, a lot of weather prediction comes through using statistics and through looking at patterns rather than actually trying to physically predict what's going to happen. So that kind of hangs on the border between a science and a proto-science. But that's not saying the future won't become a science. We may one day understand exactly how air currents fully work, how the Gulf Stream actually functions, and use that to make better predictions. So I think with anything that is, I wouldn't necessarily say masquerading as a science, but something that has some elements of science to it, but maybe doesn't meet all the criteria for being a fully fledged science. I think it has a place, but we have to be cautious with it. We have to be cautious with these things, saying, okay, this appears to explain how something works, but we can't fully accept it because it doesn't meet all the checks that we have to make on a true science. So we can draw inspiration from things like metaphysics. We can look at ideas that it suggests, maybe smaller parts of it, or the message that it's trying to send. But treating it as a science, I think, can be a dangerous place, because, and this goes back to our belief and faith as well. I would say that we have to be able to believe in science. We have to look at science, and this is a very, very general term to say just science, like there's just a big institution of science somewhere. But in terms of like scientific studies, we have to believe in them, which is why we have a rigorous process of peer review and publishing, etc. And we have to be able to believe in them. So you don't ever want to dilute the quality, I would say, or the reliability of science. But that's not to push everything else aside and say science is elitist, science is only for people who are incredibly accomplished and hold multiple degrees. Science should be open to everybody to access in the right spirit. So I think in terms of things like metaphysics, what I think you have to do is say, okay, this isn't quite a science. That doesn't mean we can't take parts of it and treat it scientifically. We just have to be aware, and again, follow our usual scientific method in terms of reviewing, looking for evidence and observations. And if a part doesn't hold up to scrutiny, then we say, okay, this doesn't fit. We need to adapt our model. So I wouldn't say there's no place for it in science, but I wouldn't necessarily say we have to embrace it because it kind of purports to be science. I think we have to be cautious in looking at that and taking on evidence as and where we can to refine our view.
Yeah, I so appreciate so many things you said there, Matt. And I understand absolutely the caution around metaphysics because it's been abused. People have been using religion to abuse people. for ever since religion existed, and ever since people existed. But I also really love what you said about how science should be open to all people. I mean, it's very encouraging to me as a scientist or person who has been classically trained in science, who's not currently researching now, to hear you say that, because there are many people who do not. Steven Weinberg, for one, who he won the Nobel Prize in physics, I forget what year, but he famously said that religion is an insult to humanity. And he also said that he hopes that science can successfully eradicate religion, and that would be the single greatest contribution that science could make to humanity. So people of faith hear that, and people of faith hear many in the universities who are saying, well, we shouldn't allow people of faith into our university because they're unintelligent and they're sort of dumbing down the academic system and stuff. So that is definitely a view that's out there. And if there are any students out there who have experienced that, I would also encourage them to reach out to me to talk more if you're interested in that. So I obviously strongly disagree with this view. I think Matt disagrees with it too, that all ideas of metaphysics or faith or religion should be eradicated. And I do think, that science can tell us a lot. I mean, as a scientist, I'm extremely passionate about science. I think the scientific method is an absolute gift to humanity, but I don't think that science can tell us the whole story. And I think that science can explain what is observed. But it can't explain everything causally. And what I mean by that is, I guess right now I'm thinking back to Aristotle's four causes, right? If anything is a sufficient explanation, it has to fit four criteria, four causes: the material, what it's made of, and then the efficient, what caused it to come into being, and then the formal, which is sort of like how it looks, and the purpose, the reason that it exists. And if you can't fulfill all four of these in your explanation is philosophically deficient, according to classical philosophy. So science can answer a lot of those four. It can tell you the how and the why of function. It can tell you, what something is made of, how it got there, sort of like what process formed it. But it can't tell you the reason for its existence. And it certainly can't speak to agency. For example, let's say that I made a cup of tea. Okay, so I have this tea that I'm drinking here. And if we wanted to learn more about this tea, we could do some science, right? We could get a chemist in here to test the tea and see what exactly is it made of? Where did the green tea come from? Where was it grown? What was the genetic composition? We could see what kind of honey is in it, because I always have honey in my tea. And we could talk about the mug, what is the mug made of, and who manufactured it and stuff. But none of that tells you why there is a cup of tea sitting on my desk right now. Science cannot answer that important question, the cause. Why is it even here? Why is it here with me while I'm on a Zoom call talking with all of you? It can't answer that question of purpose. I can talk to you all day long about a light bulb and what it's made of, and I can tell you about the science of electricity, but none of that will remove my need for an Edison, right? The agent, the mind who created that light bulb. So scientific thinking is the beginning of an answer, a very important beginning, and it's powerful and it's wonderful. And I love the fact that we have science, but natural laws don't create or cause anything. They simply describe what has already been created and what has already been caused. As Werner Heisenberg once said, he said, the first sip from the glass of natural sciences will turn you into an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. And there's a long history of scientists out there who realize that science can't answer every question, and ended up asking sort of deeper questions of meaning and purpose that went beyond the sciences. So I'll probably leave it there for now and throw it back to you guys.
That was really interesting, actually. I'd just like to come back a little bit about that, what you said about the idea of why the purpose, the agency, because I think it's interesting in that science can go a certain way to that, and I think that's what we have to be cautious with, because if we choose to just stick with faith, we could lose at some stage our ability, or not our ability, but our willingness to ask those questions. So, you know, you say science can't explain why there's a cup of tea there, but I think science could go a long way to explain that. Why is it there? You were thirsty. Why were you thirsty? Because the human body undergoes certain functions. Why do those occur? And you know, you can, I think, slowly peel back the layers on that onion, and you do get to a stage where you can't go any further with the current knowledge we have. But I think we have to make sure that we do keep asking those questions. We don't, I think if you reach a stage where you say why, because God, I think at that point you lose the curiosity, you lose the focus of science, which is to ask and answer questions. In its most basic form, science is finding questions, asking them and answering them. You know, something I say to all my students, science is just a very grown-up way of asking and answering questions. We just have built a massive model about how we do that. So yeah, I think that's, although science may not be able to go all the way to explaining something, I think as we develop our knowledge, we develop science, we get further down that rabbit hole of explanation. So I think that's a place we have to be cautious with faith and science, is that we don't necessarily just ascribe something to a faith, because that could stop progress, and science essentially is about progress. So it's, I suppose, if you wish to retain faith whilst being scientific, it's kind of like you have to move that finish line further down the road. You know, you get close to it and you have to say, okay, well, I need to move my God reason further down the road and keep, you know, pushing my way down there.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I hear what you're saying there. And I do think that science can speak to why questions, but I don't think it can speak to all why questions. And we see this historically, right? We see many, many times in human history where people have used science to try and answer these metaphysical questions, and a lot of times with disastrous results. I mean, you've got the eugenics program, you've got all sorts of things, right, where people are saying, okay, here's what the science is telling us, let's apply this to every realm of human being. And a lot of times historically when that's happened, you've seen some of the darkest times in human history, actually. So I do think there's an element of science staying in its lane. Again, I think it's very powerful. And I hear you here, because I feel that maybe your fear is that metaphysics will impinge upon science. And I think my fear is that science will come out and try to just treat human beings like machines, and sort of all that we've seen time and time again historically through the ages. So it's kind of interesting, I think, how we're both coming at the problem from very different sides, but really appreciate your thoughts on that, Matt.
So yes, these are some very interesting points that have been raised. Xandra, your cup of tea analogy reminds me of Aristotle's four causes. And of course, you have the material cause and the efficient cause. What causes something directly and what something is made of, that may be accounted for by science. But perhaps the final cause, the purpose of things, is not so straightforward with a scientific method. However, Matt, you do mention that the fact that we don't have answers now with science doesn't mean that we should just resort to saying, well, that's God then, but rather we should keep experimenting, keep expanding the horizons of science. And that leads me to the next question, which is, what is the role of scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts in this discussion?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. I think science, if you really look at it, is actually quite a modern process in terms of the speed of scientific advance. Until we really got to around, the sort of 15th, 16th century, really, we didn't really do science. We essentially had philosophy. We had natural philosophers. We talk about sort of the ancient scientists. Like Aristotle often being held as an ancient scientist, but in essence, he was a philosopher. And the scientific method hadn't really developed at that point. I think it's interesting what you say about paradigm shifts there, because I think science is something that can advance rapidly, it can advance explosively. And we can have new discoveries which immediately open up entirely new possibilities. I think that links into what Xandra was saying just before about how science has to be used cautiously. Science is not ethics. Ethics is not scientific. And you can't necessarily just shove them together and expect to get great results. You have to look at them carefully together. So I think in terms of what effects paradigm shifts have on faith, I think people of faith who have strongly held faiths and beliefs, a sudden explosion of new evidence can be something that maybe takes time to absorb. That you have a sort of rapid advance in science that maybe faith takes a while to catch up to. And again, for me as a scientist, not being against people having faith, but saying that if you have faith, you need to be ready to change it based on new evidence, that can be something difficult, I suppose, when you have something which is slowly changing. To be able to keep up with advances can be a difficult thing to do. So I think that it's important, when we have these, as you say, paradigm shifts, when we have new advances and rapid advances, that science has to recognize that faith may not follow immediately, but that again shouldn't impinge on science. I think I'm very cautious about faith preventing scientific progress. You only need to look at the history of Catholicism in Europe and times when science has been aided by funding and by encouragement, but also where science has been held back in texts that haven't been allowed to be published, or people have been dissuaded from doing certain research because it doesn't fit with the faith model at the time. I think that they can coexist, but you have to be ready to allow them to coexist, and that people from both sides of the argument, if you will, have to be ready to say, okay, well, my science doesn't agree with your faith right now, but that's not to say that your faith can't adapt and move around my science. I think science is often seen and is in a way as a bit of an immovable object, so kind of fixed. This is what we're doing, this is where we're going, whilst faith can kind of flow and change a little bit. But science can do that too. It can move, it can progress, it can adapt, just maybe not in such a fluid way, maybe, as faith can. We have to be aware of those differences between the two ways that we make progress in both aspects.
Sorry, I was just writing down something that you said because it was so good. We need to talk more. You're a deep thinker, love it. So yeah, the impact of the scientific revolution on this discussion. So I think my favorite writing on the scientific revolution is actually in the Encyclopedia Britannica, because if you read the entry, it starts with this introduction explaining how by the end of this period, science basically, in essence, replaced Christianity as the focal point of European civilization. But then as you go down and read through the entry, you have this long, long list of all these men and women who were the forefathers of all these different scientific fields who believed in God. So it's really interesting to me, this trend of people who did incredible groundbreaking science because of their belief in God, not in spite of their belief in God. And purportedly, they were curious about the world because they wanted to understand the mind behind it. They wanted to understand the God who created it. There's so many. There's André-Marie Ampère, who of course was a classical magnetism, and the Amperes is named after him. Gregor Mendel, of course, I think of genetics. And he was actually an abbot. He was an Augustinian abbot, very religious man. Maximilian Planck, who was a theoretical physicist, and I think a Nobel Prize winner. So this is a really interesting trend. And again, I'm not saying here that Christians do better science than atheists, but it's worth noting that many minds who sought God ended up in the sciences and became basically the engine of this big scientific revolution. And because again, classically, the idea is that God wrote two books. One book he wrote was scripture, and the other book he wrote was nature. And you could learn about him from reading both books. So that's a long history there, but also you have a history of people who didn't believe in God and then did science and claimed to have found God in the sciences. Many people through history, even I'm thinking of Lord William Kelvin, progenitor of the second law of thermodynamics, and he actually said, if you study science long enough, it will force you to believe in God, which I think is too strong for me. I probably wouldn't quite agree with him there, but I do find it interesting, you know, that he held that view. Also, I think it's worth noting that a lot of Christians today, well, or I should say a lot of scientists today are Christian. So I read a survey recently which said that 52% of biologists in the United States are Christian, and 41% of PhD scientists in my country attend church every Sunday. And I was curious, so I looked into this a bit just to see what the general population, how often the general population attends church on a Sunday, and it's 42%. So 41% versus 42% is very similar numerically. So it doesn't seem like pursuing a PhD in science is going to make you an atheist. But the scientific revolution itself, you know, it offered us many benefits, but also it offered us a lot of stuff that we've left behind that we know wasn't good. And it's important to ask why we left them behind. Matt touched a little bit on ethics and the difference between science and ethics and what happens when you try to conflate those. I'm reminded of Descartes, who described the yowling of a cat during vivisection as broken machinery. And if you're not familiar with vivisection, that was the practice of dissecting an animal while it was alive, just to see how the parts inside were working while it was living. So he described this screaming animal as broken machinery. And again, that's kind of one of the ideas that came out of that, which I think now we've left behind. Ethics are incredibly important in modern day science. They're incredibly important. I had to sign so many forms and documents whenever I was doing experiments in the lab with live animals because of ethics. And a lot of that comes philosophically back to the idea that creation is valuable. What has been created is valuable and it's worth respect, right? And that is a very Christian ethic. But there was one other thing that you said about a lot of times I think where faith stops science from progressing, and that is something that I as a scientist find very disturbing, and I don't think that should happen, but I think that's by and large the minority. I think what we see far more is this history of people who pursue science because of their faith, and their faith does not stop them from doing science. And again, I can, anyone who wants to read the papers that have those statistics, I'm happy to share that information with you later.
Yep, so I just wanted to add, well, we've heard you talk about like science being sort of the source of answers, or maybe not, but obviously not the only and absolute source of answers, and faith being sort of such a fundamental part for religion, and sometimes, as you said, maybe even science, but not in terms of faith, but in believing what you're doing. So my question is, if science proved, for example, that God existed or exists, then do you think that would sort of undermine faith-based religion? Xandra or Matt, you go ahead.
I think this comes back to what Matt was saying earlier about proof. What do you mean by proof? You've got two different kinds of reasoning. You've got abductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. So if it's inductive, you can take it into the laboratory, it's replicable, you can repeat this experiment again and again and get the same result. But then you have abductive reasoning, which is very different. This is a one-time event, such as the creation of the universe, which we know happened, but none of us were there. None of us saw it. So we have to use abductive reasoning. We have to use inference to look back and say, okay, what happened? We use this in history all the time. So yeah, I mean, I think that according to some people, God has proven himself. You know, the heavens declare the glory of God. So the creation points people back to him. But I think for other people, they've genuinely searched for him and don't feel that they've found him. And that can leave a lot of people feeling angry. So in terms of proof, I mean, I think it comes back to the person who is seeking answers. And I think the more genuine you are in seeking truth, the more truth you will find. And that can be a difficult and a grueling process. But I think a lot of people kind of go like this and then look for God or look for truth in general. It could be, scientific something or anything. And because it's very difficult to face parts of reality. So yes, I think that God has revealed himself enough to be found by those who want him, but not enough to force himself upon anyone. There's a great philosopher who said, God is a gentleman. So he's not going to take every person and sit them down and force them to believe in him. He gives us the choice, and that's part of what makes him a gracious and a kind God. But I'd love to hear Matt's thoughts as well.
That's not where I was expecting the question to go. I didn't expect it to say whether it would undermine faith. I was trying to say, would the existence of God undermine science? But yeah, I think it's interesting. As a scientist, I suppose I can't speak so much to people of faith, but I gather that faith, a large part of faith is the belief in something, even if you don't have the evidence for it. So by bringing in evidence, does that change the dynamic? I imagine it would. I imagine it would change the dynamic quite significantly. I think a lot of religious practices and kind of customs are based on having faith when the evidence isn't right there, and that's an important part of kind of ceremony and processes. So yeah, I would imagine that from that point of view it would change things quite a little bit. Speaking as a scientist, I mean, I think if science could, and we said earlier it can't prove anything, but if it could lend strong probabilities to the existence there is some form of God, I think that would be absolutely fascinating. They often say the greatest thing you can hear in a science lab is, oh, that's weird. When you're doing an experiment, the most interesting discoveries come when you discover something you did not expect to find. So as a scientist, I think evidence for some kind of supreme being would just absolutely blow science wide open, because we are so much in essentially removing mystery from the world. As we go forward, science removes layers of mystery and we find new layers deeper down. That's essentially looking deeper into nature. I think if we were able to find them actually out there above everything, existing outside of all of our laws of physics, outside of our most fundamental knowledges, that there is something else, I think that would be phenomenal. Personally, I think we'd be unlikely to find that. I think we've been probing for long enough as scientists that we basically have become very good at explaining things without having to resort to this unknown. I think when we have something we don't understand, we investigate it more, and eventually we do find natural physical reasons for things being the way they are. So yeah, I think it's a nice hypothetical situation to imagine. I think it would be a fascinating, and then if you want to talk about a paradigm shift, I think that would be the greatest paradigm shift of all time in science, is going from removing the need for a supreme being, an omnipotent being, or however you would classify a God, into actually having evidence that there is one. So yeah, I can't really speak for the faith side in terms of how it would change that too much. I think it certainly would have an impact, definitely. But I think personally the impact would be greater on the scientific community to actually say, okay, there is this other power, there is something that is completely, essentially unexplainable, but we know it's there. I think that would just completely change what we do, and essentially would have to possibly change the way we do science. We would have to acknowledge that maybe we actually, it is inherent in the universe, we can't prove certain things. And that would be phenomenally fascinating. I have to say, I would be, as much as I am a scientist and a non-religious, non-spiritual person, to find that out would be absolutely incredibly exciting.
Thank you very much, Matt and Xandra, for those answers. So now we will move on to the questions and answers section of this conversation for the last half an hour or so, I believe, perhaps a bit less than that. But Lorenzo, I think that you have been receiving questions from the public. Is that right?
So I haven't actually received questions. from the public, but we can continue some with the questions that we had already made before, because I think that some of them are very interesting.
Just before doing that, sorry, Lorenzo, for interrupting you. Perhaps if the public hasn't sent any questions through chat, would anyone like to either send them through chat now or say them verbally? You can raise your hands. We will ask you to unmute yourselves and you can ask your question, because we would like more interaction with the audience rather than the questions that we had planned.
Yes, so as Vicente said, if you have a question, please send it to me privately and I will tell them to Vicente and Florencia, or if you wish, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself.
Sorry, Señor Ventura, I didn't see your hand.
For both of the guests, what sort of evidence would maybe change your way of thinking, or change your position towards the believing or towards the more and more skeptic? What you would say about it?
Yeah, I can think of a couple right off the bat. So one for me would be, we don't have this technology yet, but let's say that someday we had a way of identifying every human being that had ever lived on the planet, and we were able to successfully identify the remains of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, to actually have, you know, his body, his bones, or any of his remains. That for me would make Christianity obsolete. Because if the resurrection of Christ didn't actually happen, Christianity cannot, as a religion, exist. It's completely based upon that historical event. So that's one thing that for me, I think would completely shoot my Christianity out of the water. Another thing that comes to my mind is the consistency of laws in the universe. So we have all these cosmological constants. And if those laws were not actually stable, like if the speed of light changed all the time, if we didn't have consistency in the laws of science, that to me would make me question the mind behind all of those laws, or say that there probably wasn't a mind behind all of those, because it's the consistency of the laws that points to a lawgiver. The complexity of the structure of the universe that points to that incredible genius mind. So probably the resurrection would be the number one thing that I think would disprove my viewpoint. And I'm sure there are others, but those are just the preliminary ones that came to me just now.
Thank you. Very interesting. You, Matt?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It links back to that last question we had about, you know, if we could prove there was a God, how would that change things? Because I think as much as that's a nice idea, that there will be some conclusive proof. I think in terms of the way the scientific method works, I just don't think you could ever do that. You could have, you know, we often refer to acts of God, for example, you know, and miracles, and for example. I think, you know, whatever they are, we're always going to be looking for an explanation. And if we can't find the explanation, we're going to keep looking. You know, you see a man walk on water and you go, well, okay, there must be a reason for it. In the scientific method, you go, okay, well, what is the reason? You know, how was that possible? What was going on with the water? What was going on with the person? And I think you can't necessarily prove a miracle or an act of God in that sense. So I think it's probably very, very difficult to really prove that. And I think science is kind of in a place, maybe we've even as scientists backed ourselves into a corner where we actually can never become faith believers, because our whole method is always, there is an explanation for something. And as unbelievers as years,
so maybe it would be something not scientifically in that way. I mean, that would change your or convince you, we could say, about the existence of God or whatever. It would be something not merely scientific, we could say. Am I right with that? Something like experiential. like we can say an experience, something like that. Would be?
I would say it would be that exact word, probably experiential. I think that's going to be something that will be specific to the person. So for not necessarily for the scientific community to change their mind, but for an individual person, an individual experience that they can't explain using science, and something that goes so far outside something that they say this can only be attributed to this. But I think it would be maybe not so much a necessarily massive conscious decision, but still an active decision to choose. I think as somebody who would say a devout scientist, to use kind of religious terminology there, for a devout scientist to become faithful who wasn't before, I think they would have to choose to believe in something, and that would mean a change in attitude. But yeah,
I'm sorry to ask another question related with that. So, do you perceive yourself free to choose about? I mean, not trapped in any whatever framework it is, or just whatever deterministic way, but you feel yourself as free. I mean, both of you, maybe you both feel free to choose, or you do not feel free to choose. Sorry, that's.
Yeah, I'd say I do, and I don't think anybody exists either purely scientific or purely faith-based. It's a spectrum, and it's not even a spectrum. It's two kind of things that intertwine with each other, and you lean into one or the other where you want. I mean, if I have to watch England in a penalty shootout, I'm going to close my eyes, cross my fingers, and hope that ball goes in the back of the net. But I know that what I'm doing isn't helping one bit. It's not having any effect on the game, but it makes me feel better. It's that psychological comfort that we gain from it. So I think in places you can choose to leave, and you may choose to do that to remove some stress from your life, to actually give yourself and say, okay, this is out of my control, and I'm just going to have faith that this will come good. Yeah, I feel completely free to choose, and I think that's probably the difference between where we be emotional and where we are logical. We are humans. We are not computers. We are not machines. We have emotions, and certain things make us feel good, make us feel safe, make us feel comfortable. Even if logically they may not be, necessarily having an effect on what we do. So yeah, I feel free to choose. And I think we all have to exist on that kind of spectrum. If you live your life purely only believing in logic, you're never going to engage your emotions, which is just not healthy. And if you choose to never use logic and only exist on faith, then you can get yourself into some very messy situations, and you can get yourself in all kinds of trouble because you haven't thought things through from a realistic point of view. So yeah, I think we are free to choose, and I think we have to be cautious at times of where we choose to lie on the logic, scientific side, the faith side. But I don't think there's anything to stop you from moving between the two fluidly, as you will.
Yeah, I also, I think that one of the beauties of having a belief in God, just speaking for me personally, is that it does allow for multiple avenues. And so where there might not be an explanation of, I'm thinking of something that happened in Colorado. So I grew up in Colorado, and it's a very mountainous, snowy place. And in the springtime, there was a family that was camping out there, and one of their children wandered off and got lost. And this terrible spring snowstorm came in, and there was a blizzard, and they couldn't find the child, and everyone was very worried that the child had perished. And a couple, I don't know, maybe 24 hours later or something, they finally got a rescue team there to try and recover the body. And they found this child under a tree, and he was alive. And there were these huge patches around him where the snow hadn't fallen. And so they were amazed that the child was alive, and they asked him, how are you still alive? And he explained to them that some elk had come in, and they had formed a ring around him and laid down on him to keep him warm, basically. And that's the only reason he was able to live through this terrible snowstorm. And so being an animal behaviorist, I've studied the behavior of ungulates. I understand what happens to elk during a snowstorm, and I know that they don't tend to shelter under trees. They'll go out into a meadow and gather there. They don't go up into the forests. So that didn't necessarily make sense from a biological standpoint, but because I understand God's love for humanity, and that this child, you know, had a whole family who were asking God to do something to intervene to save this boy. They believed it was an answer to prayer. So I understand that scientifically it didn't make sense at all what had happened, but there's another avenue for explanation, which I think is completely reasonable. I guess that's just my 2 cents that I would add as well to that, Aldo.
Yeah, if I could just jump back on that, I think it was interesting what you said there about, you know, that essentially somebody being saved and that respect. And I think it's, again, important, again, kind of talking caution, is that we have to understand when logic and when faith are important. So, you know, when things are out of your control, I think having a belief of faith that can be comforting, it can be helpful, but at the same time, it's no substitute for concrete action as well. You know, if somebody is sick, then praying that they get better isn't going to help them get better. And speaking as a scientist, I know other people will disagree with that, but you know, that's not a substitute for medicine. You know, if you say, okay, well, I don't want, you know, this person to, this relative, this loved one to have treatment, I want to pray that they get better. That I think can be problematic in that you're actually denying a logical proof, not using the word proven, but something that is statistically very likely to have a positive effect to something that we have no real understanding of. So that's, again, that area where we have to be cautious between, you know, faith and science, in a place where we have experience, we have evidence that something can help or that something may help in that way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Matt. If you're sick and someone is telling you, don't go to the doctor, we'll just pray for you, I would say that's very foolish and reckless. However, if I could just push back a bit on what I think the argument might be, I think, again, going back to blind faith. Blind faith would look like, this is just an embarrassing analogy, but it's the only thing that's coming to me. Let's say that I have a crush on a boy, and he has no idea I exist. He doesn't even know my name, but I am convinced that we are in love and we're going to get married and we're going to spend the rest of our lives together. And I have all of these feelings, right? I have all these feelings of hope and joy and love. And I just keep believing that this is true, even though there's no evidence for it. I just keep believing that it's true because of how it makes me feel. That is not what we call a justified true belief, epistemologically. There is no reason to believe it. You're only believing in it because of how it makes you feel. It's not justified. But different scenario now, okay? Let's say that I fall in love with a man and he treats me well, and he I don't know, what do guys do when they're wooing you? He gives me flowers, he gives me chocolates, and he's constantly praising me and encouraging me, and we're just the best of friends, and we're falling in love with each other. And then I have those feelings of hope and joy and love. Are those feelings merited now? Yes, because they're the product of something that's real. They're the product of a real relationship, not an imagined, fictitious relationship. So I think that the joy and the peace and the love that people feel when they're in a relationship with God is only merited if that God exists and if that relationship is real. And I don't think that anyone should ever believe in something just because of how it makes them feel. But if it is true, it would follow logically that you would have that kind of response of comfort, that you would have, and I think that would be a merited emotional response. So, but yeah, I would just leave that there also for consideration.
Well, thank you. We have one last question from the audience, which is, well, I think you touched upon this a little bit, but it's, can science ever replace religion? Perhaps Matt, you can start if you'd like.
Yeah, that is obviously an incredibly difficult one. I think science is always advancing. It is always adapting, evolving. I think in a way religion is too. It's kind of, I suppose, in a way, you know, if we take the approach that science and religion are at odds with each other, you can kind of see it as a kind of ever escalating arms race where science lends evidence of something, then religion goes on top of that to say, well, okay, but you haven't said this yet, then science did this, and you know, and I think in that respect, if you look at them kind of in conflict with each other like that, I don't think one can ever replace the other, because they are, by their nature, something that continues to adapt, that continues to adapt as new information, add new chapters, new facets, new different perspectives. If you see science as not necessarily in conflict with faith, but as a way of exploring your faith, or faith as a way of understanding science. I talked to her about believing in the peer review system, believing in the scientific method. I think there could conceivably be a point where essentially they don't necessarily replace, but they come together, and we have a system in which we don't necessarily attribute things to external supernatural factors, but we have faith in the scientific method. We have faith that the answers will become explained, that they are out there, and that they exist within the nature of the universe. So in terms of replacing faith and just kind of shoving it off to one side, I think that's within the conflict model, which is where essentially they'll continue advancing, just always getting ahead of each other, pulling back, stretching ahead. But if you see them as conflictory, I don't even know if that's a word, if they're not in conflict, then I think you could see eventually a point where they merge together, coming from parts where they were very far apart to becoming closer together. So no, I don't think that one science could ever replace faith, but I think the gap between them could certainly narrow, and eventually end up in a place where they're similar to each other.
I love that picture of closing the gap, Matt. That's great. Yeah, so just I guess as a thought experiment, we could even ask, because we have some data points here through history, right? We could even just ask what happens when people do try to replace religion or faith with science, because people have tried to do that through the years. I'm thinking of the People's Republic of China, for example, where they said we will completely eradicate religion. What did they say? Within 40 years, something like that, and replace it with just science, because this is how it's going to be. We're an atheist communist state, and interestingly, China has the fastest growing church in the world. Now, most of that church is underground, to be fair, and there's still a lot of persecution there. But people are not giving up what they believe about God, even at gunpoint, which I find really interesting. And these are not unreasonable people. So I guess another thing that I'm thinking of is it okay if I read a quote from a book about Schrodinger? It's just a couple sentences long. Okay, I want to be sure that's appropriate. I'm not sure about the format of the dialogue and things. But Schrodinger, if you're not aware, Schrodinger equation, he was a brilliant, brilliant man. And he inspired an entire generation of molecular biologists. So he was asked about this, if he thought that science would replace religion. So when you asked, I thought, oh my gosh, I was just reading this the other day. And here was his response to that question. He said, I am very astonished that the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. It gives us a lot of factual information, puts all of our experience in a magnificently consistent order, but it is ghastly silent about all and sundry that is really near to our heart, that really matters to us. It cannot tell us a word about red and blue, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beauty and ugly, good or bad, God or eternity. Science sometimes pretends to answer questions in these domains, but the answers are very often so silly that we are not inclined to take them seriously. And this is spoken from one of the most brilliant scientific minds of his generation. And I find it very, very interesting, his response to that question. And I don't think I could respond any better than he did. So science is wonderful. It's beautiful. I'm grateful for it, but it will never answer all the questions of the human heart.
Thank you very much, Xandra. Unfortunately, we have to end it on that note, although I wouldn't have it any other way. So thank you both for coming, and thank you all for attending this discussion and asking your questions. And yes, we'll soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so
very
much.
much, everybody.